Hello and welcome to Newshour live from the BBC World Service in London. I'm Rebecca Kesby. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is on the brink, according to a senior UN official. Carl Scow, who is Deputy Director of the UN World Food Programme, is warning that food insecurity in the Strip means that most people are not able to get a proper meal even once a day, and that as many as half the population is starving. Today, the Israeli offensive has continued against Hamas fighters in the southern city of Khan Yunis and further north in Jabalia. Hamas is designated as a terror organisation by many Western governments and is accused of using civilians as human shields by the Israelis. But the UN says while the fighting continues at this intensity, it's impossible to get enough aid in. Earlier, I spoke to Carl Scow. He was in Gaza yesterday and he told me what it was like.
So I was in Rafah, which is the city closest to the Egyptian border. The place is crowded with people. There are people everywhere, people camping on the sidewalks, donkey carts with families and their possessions, cars, and a lot of confusion, frankly, and of course, desperation. You know, we are focusing on the food situation. I met people who had not eaten for days. The survey that we managed to do during the humanitarian pause shows that half the population is starving. And of course, an environment of fear. Really, you can smell it, you can see it in people's eyes. And, you know, a lot of questions. You speak to people, they ask me, you know, what's happening next? And what can you do to help us? And there are very few answers.
When you use the word starving, sorry to push you on this, but what do you actually mean? What does that mean in real life?
People are not getting enough to eat. They're not eating at all, or they're eating once a day. And they don't know where the next meal is going to come from. You know, there is no food whatsoever in the shops. We went to a few supermarkets. They're completely empty of food. There is some shampoo maybe, but that's it. We have only been able to get some 10% of the food needed in Gaza since the start of the war. So the situation is increasingly desperate. And you can feel it when you are at the distribution sites where we distribute food and flour. People are angry. People are frustrated and they are desperate. I mean, we went to distribution lines, I don't know whether hundreds or thousands, because you couldn't see the end of the queues, frankly. And people are angry to the point that, you know, we move away quite quickly because there are so much frustration. Also, this sense of the world having abandoned the people is, of course, causing a security risk to us and to our teams, frankly. So with law and order breaking down, the humanitarian operation is really on a brink, and it's understandable. People don't know if there is going to be a next shipment, when that next shipment comes, and so they try to serve themselves as much as they can. And, you know, the toughest meeting I had yesterday was really with our staff. They are living this crisis while they're also trying to tackle it at the same time. Their families are suffering. They've been moving around themselves, and they're not safe.
The UN is negotiating, I think, with the Israeli government to maybe open up a different border crossing, Kerem Shalom border crossing, to try and get more aid in. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that is absolutely critical. And we have been pushing for that for weeks now. And it is indeed critical because we need to get to a different scale. One of the reasons why the desperations are so high and why, you know, we are starting to lose the order and control that is there is because it's just simply not enough. And it's not going to be possible to get that through the Rafah border crossing from Egypt. We need Kerem Shalom to open, but it's not the only thing we need. We, of course, need an environment on the other side that allows us to distribute. If I had 300 trucks coming in tomorrow under the current environment we are seeing, it would be very difficult to distribute that in a controlled manner.
I know you're a very experienced person with the UN and through your working life, but have you ever experienced anything like this before?
You know, I've only been in the business for 25 years, but I have colleagues who have been doing this for 45 years in Sudan, in the Congo, Afghanistan, and beyond. And they tell me that they have never seen anything like this, the complexity and the scale at all levels and the pace at which this is moving is really unprecedented.
Carl Scow, Deputy Director of the World Food Programme. Well, for a personal testimony on that issue of food scarcity, we can hear now from Ahmed Moghrabi. He's head of the Plastic Surgery and Burns Unit at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. He's also a father, and after operating on the most serious injuries all day, he says without the equipment and supplies he needs, he finds his family and faces the same problems hundreds of thousands of other parents in Gaza are facing every day. Dr. Moghrabi spoke to the BBC just after he finished work late yesterday, and it is a difficult listen which you may find distressing.
We have a scarcity of clean water, we have a scarcity of food. I used to eat only once a day. Can you believe that? After I finished the surgery, I went to see my children, and they asked me actually to bring some apple, some banana. They haven't eaten of these fruits since, since 40 days. We are starving here. I don't know how could I stand with these mass casualties, with these mass patients. I can't stand more. I came to this point just today. I spoke with my wife. If we could just flee and leave all this behind us. Can you believe that? Because I couldn't stand more. My wife, my children, they don't want to stay here because of these sounds of explosions. My children, actually, I feel helpless in front of my children. I have a daughter, 3 years old. Always she asks me some sweets, some apples, some fruits. I can't provide. I feel helpless. I can't. There is no enough food. There's no enough food. Only rice. Only rice. Can you believe that? Only rice. I eat once a day. Only. Also my children. I don't know why is this happening. Why?
Senior plastic surgeon Ahmed Moghrabi there explaining to us the circumstances he faces every day. Well, Mark Regev is a senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. A short time ago, he gave us his response to hearing that testimony from Dr. Moghrabi.
It's terrible, and Israel is doing everything we can to facilitate the supply of food into Gaza. That was one of the first decisions taken by the government when this war was forced upon us by Hamas. And we said there would be no restrictions on medicine, on water, and on foodstuffs entering the Gaza Strip.
The problem is, though, that the UN Food Programme says that it simply can't get the aid in when the level of fighting is as intense as it is at the moment. And it's saying that 9 people out of 10 don't eat every day.
I know the situation is very difficult, but Israel has, as I just said, we place no restrictions whatsoever on food entering the Gaza Strip. And I can tell you that we have actually authorized trucks to go in, and trucks have actually passed the Israeli security inspection, which is an unfortunate necessity because we don't want to see Hamas bringing in armaments and so forth into Gaza. But trucks that have already passed our security inspection are somehow stuck in southern Gaza. They can't move in.
Well,
and here, I think the issue...
desperation, isn't it, of people that want the aid?
Correct. First of all, we think Hamas is deliberately causing problems, which fits into their playbook. Ultimately, Hamas knows its only way out is for there to be an enforced ceasefire, so we're prevented from completing our mission of destroying them. And as a result, they're deliberately creating a humanitarian crisis. It's part of their playbook, of course, which is to use Gaza's civilians as the human shield for their military machine.
But with respect, it's you that's being blamed for it. It's Israel that's being blamed for the aid trucks not getting in, for the fighting being so intense that they can't get food trucks in. I mean, there's this idea that perhaps Israel could open the Kerem Shalom border crossing to maybe get more aid through that. What's happening with that?
That is being discussed. That's possible. And I might have more to say on that presently, but that's been under discussion. We don't want to see a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and we're going to do everything we can to prevent that from happening. That's in Hamas's interest. Our interest is to destroy Hamas and at the same time do everything possible to safeguard the civilian population who are not the target of our operation.
Your biggest ally, the United States, is coming under a lot of pressure today for vetoing a UN Security Council resolution last night calling for an immediate ceasefire. The UK abstained, but everyone else, including France, voted in favour of that resolution. You're running out of support, aren't you? What are you going to do if, and possibly when, the US also demands a ceasefire?
So first of all, we thank the United States of America for standing up to the automatic anti-Israel majority at the United Nations. And I'll tell you why the resolution was wrong and why the United States was right to veto it. There is no sustainable ceasefire with Hamas. It's like saying we want a ceasefire with ISIS or with Al-Qaeda. It's simply not sustainable. They themselves, the leaders of Hamas, openly declared that they would do the October 7th massacre again and again and again. Their words, not mine.
I mean, you do have a lot of sympathy amongst your compatriots in other countries in the West in your battle against Hamas. The problem is the civilian casualties and increasingly the humanitarian situation whereby today we're hearing these terrible stories of starvation in the Gaza Strip. And the difficulty you've got is that the Americans have applied direct pressure on Israel on these issues. It's told Israel that it wants to see safe areas for civilians, fewer deaths. If you don't deliver that for the Americans, that's going to make them look weak, isn't it? And that's going to make them angry with you.
First of all, we've got very good discussions with the Americans, and they themselves have said that Israel is making an extraordinary effort. I think I'm quoting directly, to try to safeguard civilians. That's why we've been asking civilians to leave areas of combat. We don't want them to get caught in the crossfire. But the major problem here is Hamas, because Hamas not only started this war, and I think Gazans understand today that Hamas is for them a real terror, because Hamas is the one, as I said, they know that Hamas started this war. They know that just last week Hamas ended the ceasefire by refusing to release more hostages. And so if their fate is tragic at the moment, it's only because of this Hamas movement. And when we have destroyed Hamas, and we will, that ultimately is obviously good for the people of Israel, who won't have to live in fear of these terrorists crossing the border and butchering their families. But that will also be good for the people of Gaza, who deserve better than this terrible, extremist terrorist regime that cares nothing for their well-being. I mean, Hamas has been in power for 16 years. And what have they brought the people of Gaza? Bloodshed, misery, and poverty.
Mark Regev there, senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Coming up later on the programme, it's 75 years since the signing of the Geneva Convention on Human Rights. So, is it working?
What we're aiming at is to create a better human being. And that's what we're trying to do with the human rights agenda, just to better improve ourselves and our conduct, to speak out and use nonviolent means to protest conditions which are fundamentally unjust and unfair. And who can argue with that?
More on that still to come. And a reminder of our headlines this hour. Rwanda has criticised the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo for comparing his Rwandan counterpart to Adolf Hitler. The United Nations has warned that 9 out of 10 people in Gaza can't eat every day and that half the population is starving. This is Rebecca Kesby with Newshour live from the BBC. The conflict in the Middle East is affecting people all over the world, particularly those with relatives in Gaza or Israel, and it's dividing people. In the US, the emotional arguments on all sides are being played out on university campuses, where there have been many demonstrations and heated exchanges. This week, the presidents of 3 elite universities are coming under pressure to resign for comments they made to the House Committee on Education. Liz McGill, who's the president of the University of Pennsylvania, was particularly criticised for the way she answered a question on reports of anti-Semitism on her campus. She later apologised, but the tensions remain, as our North America correspondent Nomia Iqbal found when she spoke to students there.
For many young Jewish students like Noah Rubin, the atmosphere on campus has been hard to cope with since the October 7th attacks in Israel.
It's very tiring. We're not being heard. This is like a real struggle that we're going through, and it's finals. You know, like a Jewish student on campus, I've been getting 4 hours of sleep this week, and it's not because I'm studying for finals that I have next week. It's because I'm fighting rampant anti-Semitism on campus.
The 21-year-old wears a Jewish skull cap and says there have been incidents where he has felt under attack by other students. He says it's become worse following comments made by the university's president, Liz McGill.
I was horrified. I can't even say that I'm shocked because nothing shocks me anymore. We don't feel safe. I know so many people, friends, who used to wear kippahs, and they don't anymore because they don't feel safe walking on our campus.
Have you ever considered removing your kippah? Have you felt unsafe?
Yeah.
What made you decide that I'm not doing that?
It's a day-by-day decision. I can't say that I've been able to wear it every single day.
The university's leadership has been grappling with divisions amongst staff and students on the Middle East war. But support for the institution's leader has eroded after a contentious exchange in Congress when Ms. McGill was asked a question.
Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct? Yes or no?
If the speech turns into conduct, it can be harassment, yes.
I am asking, specifically calling for the genocide of Jews, does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment.
So the answer is yes.
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context.
She later clarified her answer and apologised, saying she was focused on the university's long-standing policies in line with the US Constitution on free speech. But there has been fierce criticism, with the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, the highest-ranking Jewish member of the administration, saying the lack of moral clarity was unacceptable. Hilar is an Israeli-American student here who advocates for Palestinian rights and was in that congressional hearing.
Liz McGill's response was incompetent in the face of that opportunistic pressure.
But Hilar has also hit out at the congresswoman who asked the questions, Republican Elise Stefanik, pointing to her huge support for the former president, Donald Trump.
My great-grandparents were murdered in Auschwitz. My grandparents live with that legacy of genocide. I live with that legacy of genocide. And to see someone be silent on actual violent white supremacists, and then all of a sudden take up this mantle in order to prevent me, a progressive Jewish student, from standing for a free Palestine, that person doesn't care about my safety.
But many students and former students and donors are still calling for Ms. McGill, along with the leaders of two other elite universities, to resign. One Arab student told us the president has been under huge pressure from both sides to please people. He didn't want to speak on tape out of fear of a backlash, but told us he doesn't think she should lose her job. Others, like Mia, who is Jewish, feel conflicted. She is part of a group that advocates hard for free speech.
I totally understand that from the First Amendment, from the legal standpoint, speech like this is totally okay, and we should invite speech that makes us uncomfortable and challenges our opinions, but I definitely understand the limit and that this has made me uncomfortable, it's made a lot of my friends uncomfortable, it's made large communities on campus very uncomfortable, and statements like that really shouldn't be accepted.
Harvard's president, Dr. Claudine Gay, who was in the hearing, has also apologised. Her university, along with Pennsylvania and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, all now face official congressional investigations on their efforts to address anti-Semitism.
Our North America correspondent Nomia Iqbal there. Now, when Star Wars first lit up cinema screens in the late 1970s, it not only ushered in the era of the space adventure blockbuster, but also a whole new industry in film merchandise. 40 years on, the original toys have become highly sought after, some fetching a few $100,000. Business reporter and Star Wars superfan Rowan Bridge has been to one of the biggest toy fairs dedicated to that film franchise.
Welcome to Echo Base Live, the largest vintage Star Wars toy fair in the UK, where people like me come to buy back our childhood memories.
For a summer, me and my friends were just on Tatooine with all of our little Jawas and, running down a hill with my Millennium Falcon. It was just an amazing, idyllic childhood.
It takes me back to simpler times. Me and my brother loved it. It was the only thing we really connected with.
In 1977, when Star Wars burst onto the big screen, it helped launch the modern era of movie merchandising.
Kenner's new Star Wars Death Star Space Station. Action figures each sold separately.
Those figures and playsets that once sold for a few dollars can now go for prices that seem out of this world. And the rarer the piece, the greater the value. At the centre of the toy fair, in a protective case and specially lit, is the holy grail of Star Wars collecting, a prototype Boba Fett figure. The first voice you're about to hear is my colleague Steve, asking why I'm taking a picture of it.
I'm taking a photo of Boba Fett. What? I get to see this thing once in a lifetime. It's the only chance I'm ever going to... I'm never going to get this close to a rocket firing Boba Fett again in my life.
We'll get it out. You can hold it if you want.
Oh, you're kidding me?
Yeah, no, get it out.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Wow. As you might have gathered, I was rather excited. The figure itself is owned by collector Martin Schofield.
There's probably 120 of these in the world. They didn't release to the public because there was a choking hazard. We'd estimate that's anywhere between £100,000 and £150,000.
For a piece of plastic?
For a little bit of plastic, yeah.
To understand how we ended up here, take a trip with me back to the 1970s. When Star Wars came out, movie merchandising existed, but nothing like the scale of today. In what turned out to be a lucrative move, the film's director, George Lucas, took a lower fee for the film in order to hold on to the merch rights, effectively the right to put Star Wars on everything from cereal packets to plastic toys. Tim Effler was part of the team at the toy makers Kenner that worked on Star Wars.
There are so many of the elements that made it natural for a toy line. You had these fantastic vehicles, you had villains and heroes that were easy to execute and present in toy form, and I think that really got us excited about it. And the story was really straightforward, easy to follow for the most part. It was really designed for kids almost,
Now those kids like me who first played with the toys in the 70s and 80s are grown men and women who were old enough to have the cash to buy back the figures they once played with and discarded.
The older you get, you've paid off your mortgage, your kids have moved out, you've got excess money.
Nick Dykes is a Star Wars specialist at the UK auction house Vectis.
And demand drives up the prices, so if you've got a few people that are all looking for the same thing, if you've got that thing, you can charge what you want, really, within reason.
Being a Mandalorian's not just learning about how to fight.
The value of Star Wars and its merchandising hasn't been lost on Disney, who now own the franchise. They've been busy producing new films and TV projects, like this trailer for the Disney Plus series, The Mandalorian.
This is the way.
These shows are introducing the next generation of fans to the Star Wars universe, the potential vintage collectors of the future.
And that was Rowan Bridge with that report there.
This is the BBC World Service, and for episode 1 of Stories from the New Silk Road, Anna Holligan is in Norway.
The Arctic Ocean is melting, meaning there's now a way through for commercial shipping.
Transportation between Europe and the Far East is taking some 45 days through the Suez Canal. Through the Northeast Passage, you save 20 days of sailing.
But it's not just about shipping. There are potential new opportunities in the High North, including fishing, mining, and hydrocarbons. This is the story of how China is seeking to take advantage.
China is marching into areas that China believes nobody actually owns it. That includes cyberspace, deep sea, and the Arctic.
Stories from the New Silk Road, Tuesday at 9:30 and 20 GMT.
Still to come, a leaked letter from the head of OPEC has caused concern at COP28. How damaging might it be? The family of Mahsa Amini, who died in Iranian police custody, sparking nationwide protests, have been stopped at the airport en route to collect an award in her honour. The BBC's spoken to her lawyer. And plus, what a dinosaur's last dinner tells us, and we'll be celebrating Italian opera. It's all after the news.
BBC News with Gareth Barlow. Rwanda has accused the Democratic Republic of Congo of making clear threats after it compared the Rwandan president to Adolf Hitler. Congo's leader said Paul Kagame had expansionist aims and suggested he'd end up like the German dictator. The UN says half the population of Gaza is starving, with 9 out of 10 unable to eat every day. Carl Scow of the World Food Programme said nothing could prepare him for the chaos and despair he encountered there. Israel's Prime Minister says he appreciates the US decision to veto a UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. He said it was impossible to support the elimination of Hamas while calling for a halt to the war. A Swedish EU diplomat has gone on trial in Iran after being held in custody for nearly 2 years. No details have been given of the charges against Johan Flederus. The winner of this year's Nobel Peace Prize, the Iranian women's rights campaigner Narges Mohammadi, is to start a new hunger strike in prison as the prize is awarded on Sunday. She's been almost continuous detention in Evin prison since 2010. President Lula of Brazil has urged his Venezuelan counterpart to avoid measures that would escalate a border dispute with neighbouring Guyana. Venezuela has threatened to annex the oil-rich region of Essequibo. The UN Human Rights Commissioner has accused Guatemala of persistent attempts to annul the results of this year's elections. He urged the authorities to respect the will of the people. A Syrian army bombardment is reported to have killed 6 civilians and wounded 25 in the rebel-held Idlib province. Residential areas were reportedly targeted. Mo Salah has scored his 200th goal for Liverpool Football Club. The Egyptian striker took Liverpool to a 2-1 victory over Crystal Palace and to the top of the English Premier League. World News from the BBC.
Welcome back to NewsHour. The British Home Office has been ordered to give Parliament the full costing of the controversial scheme to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda after admitting projected initial spending had doubled to almost 300 million. The UK government says the deal will deter people from making the dangerous journey across the Channel, but critics point to the cost and question whether Rwanda is a safe place for them. The BBC's Mayeni Jones looks at what life is like for the refugees currently in Rwanda.
It's lunchtime at a refugee camp in Gashora, about 2 hours drive from the capital, Kigali. There are refugees here from all over the Horn of Africa. And the Rwandan government says that this camp shows that it has a long history of welcoming refugees. But the people who come here are only here temporarily. They are offered the option to resettle here or apply for asylum in Western countries. And so far, of the 2,000 people who've been through this camp since it was set up in 2019, none have chosen to stay in Rwanda.
Papa. La, la, la.
Berenice Nonga is originally from Cameroon. Her baby Blondine is just 13 months old. She was born in Libya, where Berenice fled to after she was threatened by Anglophone militants back home. They've been in Rwanda for 6 months now. As Blondine plays with keys on her mum's lap, Berenice explains why she wants to be relocated to another country.
Rwanda is really a home for all the refugees. The people are very welcoming. They take good care of us, but since I had never intended to spend the rest of my life in Rwanda, that is why I advocated to be resettled.
But not everyone is happy with how they've been treated in Rwanda. 26-year-old John is a refugee from South Sudan and now lives in Kigali. We've changed his name to protect him. He says not all refugees have a good experience in Rwanda.
I got in Rwanda 2017. It was really worst for me.
John says he spent years in refugee camps in the east of the country, fighting to get official refugee status so he could study and work. He says he got no help from the Rwandan government nor the UNHCR. He now studies and has a job, but says life in Rwanda is hard.
I don't see Rwanda as a basics for me to settle and do everything for my life.
Why is it? Why do you think that building a future in Rwanda is going to be difficult?
If Rwandans themselves are suffering, will I be fit to grow here? Out of 15, 16 million of Rwanda populations, I can say 5 million want to leave. Why? The life standard here is restricted to a certain policy. We all are restricted.
Rights groups have criticised Rwanda's human rights record, saying basic freedoms are limited. Louis Mudge is the Central Africa Director at Human Rights Watch.
This is a government where fundamental rights such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom to vote how someone wants to, freedom from arbitrary detention and torture, these fundamental rights are not respected.
The Rwandan government says it respects human rights and international law, and that they're central parts of its deal with the UK. The British government says the deal is needed to deter migrants from making the dangerous crossing across the Channel to reach Britain, and it says the money invested in the scheme is worth it.
The BBC's Mayeni Jones reporting there from Rwanda. You're listening to Newshour live from the BBC. I'm Rebecca Kesby. Some news now from the UN Climate Conference COP28. It's being hosted by the United Arab Emirates. Today a letter was leaked. It was from the Secretary General of the Organisation of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, better known as OPEC, and it's caused a bit of a controversy because in it the head of OPEC, Haitham Al-Ghas, seems to urge member countries to proactively reject any text or formula that targets fossil fuels directly rather than emissions. More on that in a moment. But many environmentalists have criticised the fact that COP28 is being held in a petro state. Amos Wemanye is a senior advisor on climate and energy at Power Shift Africa, which is a Pan-African non-governmental organisation. And he's drawn attention to the record number of lobbyists representing fossil fuel energy suppliers at this year's summit.
I think over time this process is turning into an expo. Last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, we saw that we had over 600 lobbyists, but in this Dubai COP, I think the number has really skyrocketed. We are talking about 2,400 plus fossil fuel lobbyists. This is happening in a climate conference. Fossil fuel phase out is inevitable, but they are wailing and kicking and crying because their time is up.
Well, for more details on the content of that leaked OPEC letter, I've been speaking to the BBC's climate and science reporter, Georgina Ranard.
This is from the head of the oil cartel, and it was sent to its 13 members, which do include Saudi Arabia, a big player here, Nigeria, Iran, and it's warning its members with utmost urgency that pressure against fossil fuels may reach a tipping point with irreversible consequences. So it urges the countries here in OPEC to reject any text that targets energy, so fossil fuels, and it wants those countries to move the conversation here to address emissions instead of focusing on actually stopping oil, coal and gas production. And this is sort of at the heart of these talks here. When and how and actually if fossil fuels phase out will be included in this final deal. They've never been mentioned in a cover text before, as unbelievable as that sounds. And then it gets into what would that phase out look like? Will expensive and experimental at the moment technology be used to capture some of the CO2 emitted? And will that mean that these oil-reliant nations can basically carry on burning and producing a lot of these fossil fuels? And I think it's really showing how real the debate is here now at COP, that OPEC feels compelled to warn its members about this and urge them to take this strong stance.
How damaging could all this be, and what's the reaction been like?
Fossil fuels drive the world economy. The stakes are absolutely huge. We know that fossil fuels is being very controversial at this conference. The COP president is also the CEO of Abu Dhabi's oil state giant ADNOC. So many people have come here expecting a big row over this. So in some ways I think the reaction is, well, of course OPEC would warn its members to hold the line against strong language on fossil fuels. It has been condemned by some NGOs, but I think on the other hand people are they've got their heads down and they've got their eyes on the prize, which for some nations here is strong language on phasing out fossil fuels.
OPEC actually has a representative at COP28. Some people might be surprised to hear that, given that this conference is about reducing reliance on fossil fuels.
Representatives of oil and gas companies and of fossil fuel nations have been at talks for a long time. This is actually the first year that delegates here have had to disclose their employment, so it's the first time we've had a number of how many. But for a long time they have been here under different party badges. And really what the president, what he's saying this year is that we know that fossil fuels are part of the problem, and for that reason the industry needs to be on board.
But there's twice as many fossil fuel companies there as there were last year, I understand.
Yes, that's true. I'm sure they would also say that this conference is much larger. It's the largest that we've ever had. I think what it will come down to is what type of deal is made, and that is how this conference will be judged. They are countries that rely on fossil fuels. They will have come here not wanting strong language on phasing out fossil fuels. What the OPEC letter shows is that the writing is on the wall in many ways for that industry. Countries have come here with their red lines, as it were, and whether we see an agreement in the interest of fossil fuels or in the interest of those nations that want to get rid of fossil fuels will depend on the abilities of the presidency and also the consensus that the countries here are able to come to.
The BBC's Georgina Ranard. When 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman Mahsa Amini died in Iranian police custody last year, tens of thousands of people took to the streets to protest. She'd been arrested by the morality police for allegedly wearing her headscarf incorrectly. Well, the EU's Sakharov Prize has been awarded posthumously to Mahsa Amini. Her family were on their way to collect it today when they were stopped at Tehran airport and had their passports seized. BBC Persian's Majid Afshar has been speaking to their lawyer who was travelling with the family.
They were told that they're banned from leaving the country. The authorities refused to tell them why they were banning them from leaving the country. But later on, the family issued a statement and said they now know that it's the intelligence ministry that has banned them, which is unlike other cases where you would expect the judiciary to ban people from leaving the country. And Mahsa's father, in the statement, said that they know that their only crime is that they are Mahsa's family. Just to mention that the lawyer has managed to leave the country and he would receive the award on their behalf on Tuesday.
What does it mean for the family now, and have they come under pressure from the authorities before this?
They've been under immense pressure and constant pressure since Mahsa's death over a year ago. They've been quite consistent in their narrative of or the story of what happened to Mahsa. They believe that Mahsa Amini was killed by the authorities. The authorities insist that although she died while she was in custody, they said that she died of previous conditions, health conditions she had. So they've been under immense pressure since last year. But the father said that a month ago, after they were told that they're going to be invited to go to Paris, they communicated this with the authorities and they said that this is a personal trip, they would not interfere. And now we know that they've confiscated their passports and they've been banned from leaving the country.
Mahsa Amini's death did spark unprecedented protests right across the country, didn't it? Millions of people took part. Has this incident today even been reported in Iran?
The media inside the country have not said much, but it's been widely reported by the media outside the country. We know that the media are under pressure as well, and a female journalist who talked to Mahsa's father hours after Mahsa's death, and another journalist who covered Mahsa's funeral a few days after that, are still in prison. We don't hear much from inside the country, but it's been covered widely outside.
There is another prize being presented tomorrow to the jailed Iranian Narges Mohammadi. She obviously can't be there to accept it. I think other members of her family are going to do that. Has that been mentioned in Iran, that she won the Nobel Peace Prize?
Oh yes, and it's been welcomed by the people, but not by state-run media inside the country. Her twins are there to get the prize. Today, BBC Persian talked to the chair of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, and she told us that she hopes the prize would set a light on what the authorities are doing to female activists, including Narges Mohammadi. And she said that she hopes the light would protect her and finally give her freedom.
The BBC's Majid Afshar there. Tomorrow marks 75 years since the world united around a groundbreaking document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Born out of the horrors of the Second World War, the Declaration aspired to ensure that all human beings were born free and equal in dignity, regardless of their nationality, ethnicity, religion or anything else. So how's that aim working out 75 years on? Our Geneva correspondent Imogen Fuchs reports.
This Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
momentous opening words of the Great Charter for World Peace.
It was the world's never-again moment, a charter agreed by 192 countries, guaranteeing fundamental freedoms to all.
If you came from another planet and just looked at the human rights framework, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the treaties, the conventions, you'd think you've arrived in heaven. Why is it not the case?
Representing almost 2,000 million people, they came with hope, born of common struggle.
Louise Arbour, UN Human Rights Chief from 2004 until 2008, knows the promises made are often not kept. Volker Turk, currently in the job, agrees.
I am very much concerned that we lose the essence of what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was in response to cataclysmic events during the Second World War.
75 years on, UN Human Rights sits atop a vast array of committees and experts. Their job to scrutinise countries on their records. There are whole teams looking at crisis regions. They gather evidence, often of horrific violations, including war crimes. But they can't prosecute, only publish.
I think to be the megaphone for the denunciation of injustices at some point becomes counterproductive. It just illuminates how impotent the system is. It's like you scream in the wilderness.
Russia bombed it. A war crime, UN investigators say.
Commissioned by the UN, it says the UK government's welfare policies have had tragic consequences.
But even if it is just screaming, no country, whether it's Russia over war crimes in Ukraine or the United Kingdom over child poverty, wants a negative report from the UN. Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein, Human Rights Chief until 2018, believes the UN shouldn't flinch from disapproval, even from the most powerful.
I knew from my experience in the former Yugoslavia that if the UN believed that it's in the friends business, it produces catastrophic results.
Would you allow U.S. interrogators to waterboard terrorist prisoners?
Absolutely. Believe me, it works, okay?
And so when Donald Trump argued in favour of torture, Zaid didn't hesitate.
Someone asked me about Donald Trump, and I said, yes, I think he's dangerous. I mean, how could you not think that?
Non-stop flood of migrants stretching resources to the max.
The numbers using small boats to cross the narrow but deadly stretch of water between France and England.
And less developed countries, sometimes struggling with conflict, can be irritated by what they see as double standards from the wealthy West. But Louise Arbour think they have a point.
The West